Singularity by William Sleator, 16. I'd be in here for a year. The first thing I did was get in bed and try to go to sleep so I wouldn't have to think about what I was doing. But sleep seemed impossible. I kept picturing the monster in the sink behind me. Last time we had checked on it, it had still been far away from the surface, and we had figured that the earliest it could come through would be tomorrow. I'd be well out of here before then. Even so, my awareness of it, so close behind me, was not conducive to sleep. I also felt guilty. Here I was carrying out this thing, and Barry had only threatened to do it. Maybe he had never really meant it. I certainly wouldn't have expected him to have the patience. Finally, I did sleep. When I woke up, hours later, I immediately unlocked the door. For a second, I thought the calculator had broken. It still said 1:30. It was pitch dark out, but the calculator numbers were luminous. I peered closer. What it actually said was 1:30:05. 5 seconds had gone by, or maybe even less, since I hadn't noticed what the seconds said when I had gone in. I would have to start noticing them now. I let the door slam shut and grabbed a book from one of the piles that covered the floor. I needed to distract myself from the thought of how long I would have to stay in this tiny prison to accomplish anything. It was something called The Diary and Letters of Madame d'Arblay, and I opened it to a page describing a glittering ball in a palace full of ladies and officers planning intrigues. I realized that I would not see another human being for a year. I threw the book to the floor. "You never liked parties anyway, you dope," I said aloud, but the sound of my own voice made me feel even worse. I gulped down a candy bar, ignoring the thought that now there were only 7 left. I clawed through the trap door and grabbed a package of survival biscuits. I was almost afraid to try one. Barry had grown sick of them after one night. I would have to live on them for a year. On the wrapper, it said they provided the recommended daily allowance of protein and all other nutrients. I tore open the wrapper and bit into it. It was chewy and tough and bland, with a rancid aftertaste. It made me think of a dish of oatmeal that has been sitting out in the sun for days. It felt dry and crusty and gluey between my teeth. I fumbled open the jar of peanut butter and scooped up a huge wad of it with my fingers to kill the taste of the biscuits. It was a big jar, the size we usually went through in a couple of weeks. "Don't think about it. Don't think about it. Don't think about it," I ordered myself. My voice sounded like a crazy person's. I sobbed and threw myself down on the bed, kicking and beating it with my fists. Then I squeezed the sheet between my fingers and curled up my legs. The sheet was almost unpleasantly grimy. It would get a lot grimier. The day dragged on forever. The place was a disorganized, uncomfortable mess, with books piled all over the floor. And it got messier as I searched through the piles for something interesting to read. But I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every time I managed to read a page, I would start wondering how much time had gone by. I looked outside at the calculator when I was hungry for lunch, but it was only 1:30:07. Every time I looked out into the horizon, into the horrible black night, the clock seemed to be going slower. I craved another candy bar, but if I ate one now, there would be only 6 left to last me a year. I knew I'd feel horribly guilty if I gave in, but I was afraid I'd throw up if I ate another one of those disgusting survival biscuits. I banged my fist on the table and sobbed again. The first milestone came 2 miserable days later, when the clock in the night outside had finally changed to 1:31. "Congratulations, it's 1:31, I said. "A whole minute, you can do it." "No, I can't stand it," I screamed back at myself, pacing, kicking at the tumbled-down mountain of books. There was no floor space left, but I felt too miserable and disorganized to neaten the place up. "What difference does it make?" I asked myself. "Why bother?" I worried about the creature. I felt guilty about Barry, but I also spent hours brooding about all the horrible things he had done and said to me. It made me furious. I'd never felt this angry in my life. "You're a nasty, mean creep, Barry. I hate you," I would scream. "And now I'm going to be a whole year older than you. You'll never push me around again." "But you're the stupid one, Harry," I screamed back. "You're the one who ended up in here. You're torturing yourself more than Barry ever did. You're crazy." I kicked a pile of books across the room and then howled. I had forgotten I was barefoot. Did I really have to stay here for an entire year? After all, I'd be older than Barry in a couple of weeks or months. But I quickly saw the flaw in that excuse. I couldn't, in the natural world, be Barry's real older brother unless I was at least 9 months older than he was. Otherwise, I'd just be a kind of freakish anomaly, and I didn't want that. I wanted to be like any ordinary older brother. For that 9 months was necessary, and I might as well make it a year just to even things off. To bolster my confidence, I reminded myself that I wasn't only doing it to get back at him, though I knew that was a big part of it. This was also the best way to deal with the creature. I had worked it all out back in my bedroom. As Big Brother Harry, I could take control and not have to throw away the keys. I could warn people and at the same time show them exactly what I was warning them about. The old Harry couldn't do that, but Big Brother Harry would have the dominance and strength of an extra year. That was why I had to stay. "So what?" I screamed. "Who cares about warning people?" I threw a shoe at the sink. As the days went by, I began to be aware of an unfamiliar physical restlessness. Unlike Barry, I had always been lethargic, perfectly happy to lie around forever without moving a muscle. But I had never had the chance to do that until now, and now I was beginning to find out that perfect physical inactivity was not so richly satisfying. I stretched and paced obsessively, slipping on books, hardly aware of what I was doing. In my dreams, I always seemed to be on the move, either chasing Barry or being chased by the monster. In my waking hours, I daydreamed about going for a walk, and then actually began to hunger for the sensation of running, an activity I had previously detested. It occurred to me during the second wretched week that maybe I could go outside and walk around a bit every once in a while. I reached for my calculator to figure it out, and then remembered I couldn't use it for a year. I screamed and tore the cover off a book and hurled it against the wall. Then I found a little pencil and sat down to calculate on the book's title page. It was called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. My calculations were profoundly disheartening. If I went outside for only 5 minutes every playhouse day, then it would be morning out there in a mere 9 weeks, and I had to age a minimum of 9 months. It was hardly worth going outside for less than 5 minutes, so I would have to do it less often. If I went outside for 5 minutes once a month, it would slow my aging down too much, but it would probably be more frustrating than it was worth. It wouldn't slow my aging down too much, but it would probably be more frustrating than it was worth. But if I went outside for 15 minutes once a month, then it would take me until almost 7, Barry's time to age a full year, and he might be awake before then. I couldn't take that risk. How about 15 minutes once every 3 months? At that schedule, I would be a year older at 4:41 Barry's time, and I had never known him to wake up that early, and 15 minutes every 3 months would give me something to look forward to, and be a way of breaking up the year. It would be a kind of holiday. The first 3 months would be up when the clock outside said 2:06:30. It was now 1:35:09. "You lucky thing," I told myself in a sarcastic falsetto. "In 3 months, you can go outside in the dark for 15 minutes. Isn't that thrilling? Now you have something wonderful to look forward to." I jumped up from the table and threw the chair to the floor, but it didn't help. The utter bleakness of my situation struck me then with full force. My itch to move became intolerable, a kind of madness. If I didn't do something drastic, my muscles would take control and drag me screaming out the door. Without thinking, I bulldozed the piles of books aside to make a clear space on the floor, threw myself down, and began violently doing push-ups, then sit-ups. Only utter desperation could have driven me to such bizarre behavior. But after 8 push-ups and 10 sit-ups, as I lay there dizzy and gasping, I was aware of a sense of relief in my weakly fibrillating muscles. Calisthenics, detestable as they were, might help my body accept confinement, and they would be a way of marking the endless days. It occurred to me then, for the first time, that establishing a daily routine might be a way to keep from going insane, and it was a kind of miraculous coincidence that as I lay there on the floor, my pulse taking forever to return to normal, my eyes fell on a spiral notebook at the bottom of one of the piles of books. I must have taken it by accident in the dark house, but now I reached for it hungrily, and it was unused, 100 blank-lined sheets. I had already found a package of long, unsharpened pencils in a little metal kitchen cabinet beside the table. They could be sharpened with a knife, and might last long enough if I was careful. 100 sheets meant 200 sides. That gave me half a page of paper a day with room to spare. 1:35:09 was the most important day so far, the first date in my diary and the beginning of my new routine. It was a terrible struggle at first, a constant battle not to skip days and fall back into total lolling disorganization. Yet, when I did stick to even the easiest routine, I felt like a happy baby. The sense of accomplishment made me so proud of myself that it was in itself encouraging. A kind of reward. It took a period of trial and error for me to develop a good schedule. I had to move activities around and put them in the order that was easiest to stick to. I also had to be rigorous in order to be satisfying. But I persevered. From the very beginning, sticking to the routine made me feel so much better that I knew it was the only way to survive. Strangely enough, it made me feel free in a way I had never experienced before. By 1:40:19, the pattern had become firmly established. Now, immediately upon waking up every morning, I would do my push-ups and sit-ups. I knew they were necessary, but I still hated them and wanted to get them over with right away. Next, I would give myself a thorough shave. I had considered growing a beard, but decided against it. If I were clean-shaven, whatever distinguished my 17-year-old features from Barry's 16-year-old ones would be immediately apparent, and it was another way of killing time. Since I had no mirror, I would go over my face with my fingers to make sure I did a complete job. I worked as slowly and carefully as possible. The longer the process took, the better. Then came another duty to be dispensed with early in the day, a check on the reflection in the sink. As I stared down at the rows of malignant fangs, I would think of Barry. It wasn't that I saw Barry as monstrous. I thought of him because it was he and the creature who shared the responsibility for my being here. They were also both trapped in time, statues, while I lived and moved and grew. That knowledge gave me a boost of confidence that increased my determination not to give in to either of them. After that, I would put on clean clothes and sit down for breakfast. I had found a jar of 500 super-strength multivitamin capsules in the cabinet, and I swallowed one before I ate. As I gnawed on the survival biscuit and washed it down with glasses of cold water, I would concentrate with all the clarity and attention to detail I could muster on the breakfast room at home. I thought of my place at the table, the blue woven placemats, the white dishes. I thought of soft-boiled eggs, icy orange juice, and hot buttered toast. I thought of the red checked curtains and the flowing plants on the windowsill, but most of all, I thought about the sunlight pouring through the window, warm on my face, glittering on the edge of my glass. In the winter months, sometimes, the angle and intensity of the light would be so dazzling that I would have to squint against the glare in order to see Barry's face across the table. "Would you like me to pull the shade down so you can see better, honey?" Mom would say. "No, thanks. It feels good," I would tell her. I thought about that a lot. After breakfast, I would clear the table and make the bed. Then I would return to the table with my current serious book. I usually had 2 or 3 going at once, a lighter one and a heavier one. I would pretend I was studying for a test and would be responsible later for a thorough knowledge of the material. I didn't have enough paper to take notes, but there were plenty of pencils for underlining, and I would fold down the corners of important pages. I would work hard at it, going over and over difficult passages until I was sure I understood them, often reading them aloud. Lunch would be another unadorned survival biscuit and water. I had calculated that if I ate one half teaspoon of peanut butter a day, the jar would last for a year. I saved it for supper. During lunch, I would concentrate on the school cafeteria. For the last year or so, Barry had stopped sitting with me. Lunch at school had been a rather frantic experience. It would start with trying to hook up with a friend on the way to the cafeteria so that we'd be in line together, and then, I hoped, automatically sit together. If I didn't find someone in line, I would take my food quickly and then stand there with my full tray, scanning the room for empty places beside people I knew. Often there weren't any. Then I would have to go through the ordeal of sitting alone, trying not to feel horribly conspicuous. I would tell myself that it was really much pleasanter here in the playhouse, but I would still try to reconstruct in my head the noisy babble of conversation, the clatter of trays and silverware, the sloppy joes on soft buns, watery canned beans and pink Jell-O cubes quivering under blobs of non-dairy topping. I had complained about food at school, as everyone did. It seemed scrumptious to me now. After lunch, I did my chores. In the first weeks, there had been books to organize, the ones I had brought over as well as the ones that had already been here. I arranged them by general categories, and then within the categories alphabetically by the author. I set them spine outward along the walls and under the bed and table and sink, piled on top of each other in horizontal rows. Since there were no shelves, once I had the books organized, I would use the chore time for sweeping and dusting. The insects and silvery powder continued to accumulate on the floor under the sink, though not as rapidly, of course, as it had seemed to happen from outside the playhouse. Another chore I did at this time was laundry. There was plenty of hand soap stored up under the rafters with the survival biscuits, and the sink was nice and large, just as if, once again, Uncle Ambrose had envisioned spending a lot of time in here. The wet clothes could be draped over the rafters, where it was warm, as in the attic, and they would dry there in a couple of days. When the chores were done, I would turn to my lighter reading. By light, I basically meant fiction, though for the most part it was not at all what I would have considered light reading in the old days. There were novels like Moby Dick, Anna Karenina, The Way of All Flesh, books that people in school groaned about having to read, and would frequently avoid altogether by obtaining study guides. English had never been my strong point, but now, not surprisingly, I found these books vastly entertaining, often exclaiming or laughing out loud as I read. Before I realized it, I would be at the end of what I would have expected to be an interminable chapter, and I would have to force myself to read more slowly so as not to use them up too fast. There was a certain satisfaction in the knowledge that I was doing a significant amount of the rest of life's homework. When I had first organized the library, I discovered, with nearly hysterical excitement, that Uncle Ambrose had a small collection of paperback mysteries and even some science fiction. With my newly developed willpower, I managed to prevent myself from devouring all these books immediately. I made a pact with myself that I would read one of these books only after finishing two of the more ponderous works. By spacing them out throughout the year, I would always have some deliciously fast-paced tidbit to look forward to. I would consider late afternoon to have arrived when I began to be hungry for supper. But supper, the most sumptuous meal of the day, had to be put off for as long as possible. I would close the book, take off my clothes, and proceed to the next step in my routine, jogging in place. This activity had come to be a pleasure, not a penance like calisthenics. Therefore it belonged toward the end of the day. Moving my legs up and down stimulated my brain, and I would relive amusing conversations I had once had with Barry, or with friends, or with Mom and Dad. I would remember movies and trips in great detail. I would go over in my head what I had read that day and try to decide what were the most important facts, the most telling insights about people. I would jog until I was sweating copiously, leaving drops on the floor with every step, and my throat was dry. Then I would sit down on the metal chair and wait for the sweat to evaporate and let my mind wander. But very often my mind, which had been stimulated by the running, would just go blank. I would think about nothing at all, staring at the wall and feeling the blood coursing through my veins. After a while, I began to notice that this meditative rest period left me with an unexpected feeling of well-being. It was terrible in here, yet at this time of day I actually felt happy. I never would have believed it possible. Then I would take my bath, standing beside the sink. It wasn't necessary to fill it up and create the disturbing reflection. I could get wet all over by sticking the various parts of my body under the tap. I didn't get dressed again after my bath in the morning. It was important to put on clean clothes, just as a way of making it seem like morning. But once that had been accomplished, I didn't need clothes. I enjoyed spending the evening without anything on. That was something I wouldn't have a chance to do very often when I returned to the real world. I would fill the glass with water now and sip it slowly, thinking about sitting around before dinner with Mom and Dad at home. It was during this aperitif period that I would allow myself, for the first time all day, to open the door and check on the date. I had learned very early on that it was vital to my emotional well-being not to open the door until my biological clock told me that it was evening. Nothing was more important than to preserve the illusion that day and night were occurring. All day I would keep busy, and at frequent intervals imagined sunlight coming through the windows at home, sunlight filling the meadow outside the playhouse. To open the door at any other time but evening would bring home to me the terminally depressing fact that it was always night out there and always would be. There were no mere 6 months of darkness, such as inhabitants of the Arctic zone endure. This was an entire year of it. It was necessary to avoid that reality by any means, however artificial. Checking the clock was inevitably disappointing, but could not be avoided. There was also the terrible temptation, once the door was open, to escape, and so I would always do it after running, when I felt most at peace with myself, and just before dinner, which functioned as my reward for closing the door and staying inside. For my appetizer, I would have 1 potato chip. I had a big 1-pound bag of them. When I had first devised my menu, I thought I might have to eat the potato chips quickly instead of spacing them out over the entire year. Once opened, the chips would go soggy in about a week. But I actually didn't want to eat them all at once. I wanted to have them to look forward to. And it was the potato chip dilemma that had given me a brilliant idea. There was no reason why the chips had to age a year, so why not keep them outside on the threshold? Outside, they'd only be sitting around for a few hours, not long enough to get stale. The same was true for the peanut butter and the cookies and the candy bars and vitamin pills and even the survival biscuits. I piled the food up outside the door. Animals wouldn't be a problem, since the door would be opened by me every 24 seconds their time, which wouldn't give them a chance to eat much. And so, when I opened the door to check on the time, I would snatch my food for dinner and the next day's breakfast and lunch. It gave me a little charge to be reaching out into real time, like a scientist poking his head into one of those insulated boxes with the padded gloves, working with hazardous materials. There was no reason why I couldn't keep milk and cereal and bread and butter and fresh fruit out there as well, I now realized. On my 3-month walk, I would get those items from the house. They would make life a lot pleasanter in here. For now, however, my dinner consisted of 2 survival biscuits sandwiched together with a succulent half-teaspoon of peanut butter. After dinner, I listened to music. I had brought my portable tape player and 4 cassettes. I had already been quite familiar with all 4 tapes, and would soon grow to know them so well that I hardly even heard them as music. What was important about listening to them was that they were sounds coming from outside myself, a real physical reminder that the world did exist out there, a promise that someday I would return to the world. Next, I would write in my diary, dating each entry with the time on the clock. The entries were not particularly gossipy or suspenseful, but it gave me a chance to note what I had been reading and what I was thinking and daydreaming about. And it helped tremendously, especially when I was depressed, which was often at the beginning, to express my emotions. Though the diary could never respond, writing in it did have the quality of speaking to another person. That made it one of the most important activities of all. I was now looking forward to my first 15-minute walk at the end of 3 months, as if it were Christmas. I had made other plans to go along with it. What if I didn't eat my second candy bar until the day of my walk? Then I could eat 2 candy bars that day without ever going over my quota of 1 every month and a half. I had decided to save other things up as well, and make it into a real holiday celebration. I was reminded of the religious practice, which we had never observed in family, of fasting before an important holiday feast. If I didn't eat any peanut butter at all for 12 days before the Great Walk, then I would be able to gorge on 2 whole tablespoons at one sitting. According to the label, there were 24 chocolate chip cookies in the unopened bag on the threshold. I vowed I would eat cookies only on Great Walk days. That would allow me to overindulge on 8 of them on each holiday. There would, of course, be only 3 holidays during my stay in the playhouse. At the 3-month, 6-month, and 9-month milestones, the final quarter at the end of 12 months would, for obvious reasons, require no special preparations to make it the greatest holiday of all. It was one evening when I was washing my hair that I noticed how long it was getting, almost covering my ears. My first thought was that I would have to cut it. There was a scissors in the cabinet drawer. It wouldn't be easy without a mirror. It would probably look terribly hacked and uneven. But it was beginning to take quite a while to wash it. and every day, and even longer for it to dry. But what did that matter? I had plenty of time to kill. The more time-consuming activities I could make for myself, the better. I had never been allowed to let my hair grow much before, and was a little curious about how long it could get in a year. Would it reach as far as my waist, or possibly even farther? This was probably the only chance I'd ever have to find out. It would be amusing. It would be an amusing experiment. One more way of marking time. Immensely long hair would also make me look strikingly unlike Barry, and would emphasize all the other differences there would be in our appearance. I decided not to cut it at all. It was satisfying as the weeks went by to see the diary pages fill up, and as the days progressed, they seemed to go faster. Before I knew it, it was 2:0054, and there were only 2 weeks left before the Great Walk. 2 days after that, on 2:0142, I had to stop eating peanut butter for supper in order to save up the 2 tablespoons for the feast. But that was easy. I was so excited about the Great Walk that I didn't have much of an appetite. And then it was 2:0342, and there was a week left, then 2 days, and then I was writing in my diary on the eve of the Great Walk. I didn't expect to sleep much, but somehow I did. I opened my eyes. The wonderful day had arrived. I told myself that I didn't need to observe my routine on the Great Walk holiday, and yet the first thing I did without thinking was my 30 push-ups and 50 sit-ups. Then I carefully shaved. Then I checked on the reflection. Then I had my usual breakfast. My routine had become second nature to me. I didn't even want to break from it. I went through the entire day as usual, not even eating one of my 8 cookies or 2 candy bars. The feast, of course, would come at the very end of the day, after the Great Walk itself. I would need something very powerful to get me back inside the playhouse. I washed socks and underwear, I jogged in place, I bathed, and then, suddenly, I was standing at the open door with the flashlight and the keys. The calculator said 2:0638. The moment had arrived. My emotions were so powerful I was almost in pain. I stood without moving inside the door. Then I said, "Happy holiday, Harry." For the first time in 3 months, I stepped outside. And that is the end of chapter 16.